A glance in the mirror. Chapter 11. Beside the loom. In the 1920s, most working-class families expected their children to contribute to the running of the household. Tasks were learnt by following their parents round the home, helping as they went. The boys took on the heavier work, whilst the girls helped out with the sewing and food preparation. Water had to be brought from the stream, and every day its routine of household chores had to be completed. Even though Tatworth had two main employers that made the village more self-sufficient for jobs, at least 40% of labour was connected to the land. Agricultural prices had been falling for 6 months and continued to fall. The price of wheat had halved in 6 months, and the farmers, to combat this, shed workers, reducing prices, and reduced the acreage of cereal cultivation. It took 10 years of struggle for the farming industry to recover, and by 1932 the Wheat Act guaranteed prices and control through marketing boards. Knowing that her daughter needed work, her mother arranged for her son Cecil to introduce Elsie to Mr. Phelps, the manager of the lace mill. Her good references and connection with the factory through the family ensured that she would stand a good chance of being employed to become a trained lace-hand. This was no light matter. Only 1 child in 6 was offered training of some kind, and to be an apprentice was even more difficult. Her references and good school report stood her in good stead. She started work at the small and Tidmouth net factory in 1922, the 4th member of the Collins family to work there. This was 3 years before the mule spinners became the first group of workers to be enrolled as legalized trade unionists. The man in charge of the lace factory was Fred Phelps, who lived at the top of St. Margaret's Lane, opposite the thatched Chapel of Ease. The Perry Street Lace Mill was Tatworth's main employer, giving work to over 50 people in lean times and 100 when in full production. Cuff and Co. had developed the mill in 1830, and 10 years later J.B. Payne had bought it but had very little capital to develop it. The power was supplied by a feeder pond discharging into Leets. During the next 10 years the industry was in doldrums, and the workers on half-time. This unsettled production was caused by the usual social problems: industrialization, labour problems, cost of living, export restrictions, fashion changes, and wars. In effect, lace for fashion was a luxury. However, for mosquito netting it had a permanent place in the nation's shopping list, and during wars and troop settlements abroad, later it was for parachute silk. Mr. Phelps, the works manager, saw to it that Elsie was properly taught, and then she was placed under the watchful eye of one of the senior lace hands. It wasn't long before she was crawling about under the looms, joining the broken thread, in company with the other girls. Eventually she was allowed to wind the bobbins. The Manchester spinners, their wagons rolling into the mill yard at frequent intervals, supplied the yarn by the hank, which was slipped over the free-running spoked frame, drawn off by Elsie and her fellow trainee girls onto wooden bobbins. When sufficiently filled, the wooden bobbins were placed into a basket, taken to the machine bobbin rack, and placed in rows, their threads taken through feeder guides to brass bobbins, 1.5 inches diameter, within a slim case. Once winding completed, they were packed tightly into a bobbin carriage, ready to be inserted into the lace machines. The yarn from each bobbin threaded through an eyelet. Another rack was filled with a long line of wooden bobbins, their threads drawn off and taken through guides to converge with others, warping onto a drum. From the drum, groups of threads were taken off onto a long roller called the beam, and this beam was then taken to the lace machine and placed in position. A bundle of threads were then untied, led through the guides to the net roller, and when given tension, the warp was ready. The brass bobbin carriages were then set into slots in the machine. The machine was set into motion. The weft thread was given a twist, and it engaged with the warp thread, making a series of interlocking loops. Terry's mother worked at the mill with her assistant for 10 years. The great mill wheel within the building on the ground floor below, revolving with enough weight and power to shake the building, throbbing and thrusting away as it gathered speed. A clackety pulsating action that seemed to be beating time with your pulse. The mill's power transferred by an iron shaft beneath. Above, on every floor, the pulleys, spindles, cogs running in and out, and drive belts slapping and clapping as they started the bobbins spinning. Then nothing but the mighty crescendo could be heard. The Lacehand signalled to each other by hand, mouthing the words, much like the deaf and dumb. The world trembles as the tiny cotton particles dance to the tune. It was the job of her father to repair and make his own machines in the workshop alongside the mill. The Lacehand, or twist hand, worked with a boy or girl to look after a pair of machines, setting the machine up, untying a bundle of warp threads, leading them through the guides to the net roller, to be tensioned. When the brass bobbins were slotted into carriages, the machine was ready, knitting, twisting as it engaged with the warp thread. The labourers made up the largest numbers in the mill, followed by lace menders and lace hands. After learning the trade, Elsie was paid 5 shillings a week. A labourer's wage was 46 shillings a week. Nearly all lace manufacturers kept a general store and made the workers take goods for money. 2 loaves of bread and half a pound of butter formed part of the weekly allowance. She could well remember the noise made by the machinery, the dust and the fluff that flew about being breathed in, and the danger of fire and explosions. Elsie worked amongst the rows of whirling spindles, where the threads broke when the tension was too great, as the thread twisted and spun. Her first job was to repair these broken ends as quickly as possible, moving as fast as she could, taking care not to slip on the oil-soaked wooden floors. It was so hot in the spinning and weaving sheds, maintaining a moist atmosphere to prevent the threads from breaking, that the girls just wore their slips throughout each day. Elsie stayed there for 10 years until she was 24, working her way up the ladder, becoming in turn one of the senior lace hands. Both men and women operated a number of looms packed closely together. Although this made a short distance to cover, it was tightly packed. The operator had to maintain his or her own looms, making sure the area was swept clear and the machine was oiled. The breaks in the cotton and lack of weft made good if the young trainee girls were not there. The weaving shed was kept cool and damp in summer and steam-heated in winter, the object being to stop the cotton from breaking and to assist in a better weave. The dripping condensation and damp atmosphere did nothing for colds and chills. In summer the floors were kept damp to hold down the flying dust and fluff, which could become hazardous, being inflammable and causing lung damage. From accounts of factory life at the turn of the century, it's obvious that the working conditions for both men and women would not remain in such a depressing state. The comparison is easy to make between the periods through each of the world wars, both lengthy agricultural depressions. It is also not difficult to see why these depressions were immediately reversed by rearmament and conscription. The Second Agricultural Revolution saw the state intervene to reconstruct rural Britain. There was an urgency to expand production at any cost. Harry gave up being a self-employed lace mill engineer when he was 65. The Salter and Stokes Creamery had opened up in South Chard near Chard Junction some years previously. Wishing to have a more secure working environment, Harry and his sons went to work there, and later the Wiltshire United Dairies started a milk processing plant on the site, to become the most modern in the world at the time. Shortly afterwards it became part of the United Dairies group, then in turn Cow and Gate, which is now part of the Unigate group. Only a cycle ride away from Tatworth is Forde Abbey. Mrs. Elizabeth Roper, who died in 1943, inherited the Cistercian foundation of Forde in 1905 from her cousin, Mr. William Evan. The original abbey had been built to accommodate 12 brothers in 1142, after taking 6 years to build. By 1200 it was considered one of the major scholastic religious foundations in Britain, continuing its role until the dissolution of the monasteries in 1539. The last abbot, Thomas Chard, considerably enlarged the building, adding the cloisters. After the dissolution it fell into decay, until bought 100 years later by Sir Edmund Prideaux, who later became Oliver Cromwell's Attorney General. He further enlarged it until it reached today's proportions. In 1702 the estate came by marriage to Sir Francis Gwynn, whose inheritors continued the ownership until a relation of the present family, and Mrs. Bertram Evans, bought the building and nearly 2,000 acres of land, including 5 farms, in 1864. In 1905 there were 8 resident servants for the family. The in-house servants included a housekeeper, governess, a nurse and a nursery maid, a cook, a parlour maid and a tweenie, who combined the duties of housemaid with those of the kitchen. For outside duties the coachman, chauffeur and stableman, who occupied the stable mews, whose duties involved driving the new car. The brougham was still kept, as were a pair of horses for carriage work, and a hunter for him. Head gardener with a staff of 4 who maintained the kitchen garden and park, and pigman whose duty included the pigsty, chicken houses and milking the cow. The laundry was done outside the house in the village, as was the shoeing of the horses. Increasingly the number of servants were reduced, the work taken over by part-time staff. As the main services were introduced, so there was a further reduction of staff. Before mains water was piped to the Abbey, there was a great deal of water to be supplied to the rooms daily. There was 3 breakfasts to prepare, for the nursery, the schoolroom at 8, and for the dining room at 9. It was the housekeeper's job to control and direct the staff inside the house. Many of the servants' duties carried on over into other tasks to help. The gardener and stable hand trimmed the lamps, filled the lamp bowls and pumped water into the cistern. Life at the Abbey was highly structured. To maintain the house and grounds required an enormous amount of work. It needed to be painted on a regular basis, both inside and out, and the grounds kept mown. The annual spring clean was a major event, when the number of village girls were employed to dust, polish and attend to the crystal chandeliers. Mrs. Roper, the owner, announced locally that there was a vacancy for a live-in maid, house cleaner. It was common knowledge that the Ropers were good employers and considerate towards their staff. Elsie's sister told her about the vacancy. Now there was an opportunity to leave the dust and grime and take on a new life. Elsie excitedly told Mr. Phelps the next day, and he graciously agreed to write out a reference, which she posted the following day. The post confirmed her application was satisfactory, offering her an interview. This she kept, forming a high opinion of Mrs. Roper. It was a roaring success, built mainly of the superb references given by Mr. Phelps. Mrs. Roper was so impressed that she offered Elsie the vacant post of lady's maid, a great step up in the world of service. She was lucky, employed by someone considered a very good employer. Mrs. Roper was fortunate too, in that Elsie was very keen to leave the mill, to do more gentle and refined work in comfortable surroundings. In 1932, at the age of 24, Elsie left the lace factory for good. Mrs. Roper was delighted to find someone who understood quilting and cap-making, even though they were outdated skills. A lady's maid was often expected to originate new dresses whilst updating others. Her new main task was to dress and fashion her mistress's hair. Having worked at the lace mill, she was familiar with the skill of maintaining materials, cleaning, stitching, and readapting old work.